I'll just give a little bit of background, first of all, to the course that I teach on, basically. And what I plan to do in this short session is three different things. I'm just going to outline three different theoretical models of academic writing in the social sciences that has been very impactful on my own approach to teaching and lesson planning and syllabus planning. I'm then going to introduce I'm going to try and keep it quite practical. So I'm going to introduce like the first term basically the syllabus of the first term of my academic writing program that I teach on here at the LSE. It is specifically centered at international students, postgraduate students. Then I'm going to outline two different approaches to an academic literacies approach to academic writing, two specific details that play quite an important part in like a couple of different lessons that I've taught on this term, and they've both been informed by that third model of academic writing, academic literacies. So I'm just going to briefly outline those models, then make it a little bit more practical. So theory first, and then we can have the practical stuff, for dessert afterwards. So that's basically what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do today. Hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end if you have any. Okay, so little bit of background first of all. So we are a small group of academic English teachers. We teach English for academic purposes at the LSE. We're quite a small group, and we provide quite a specific service, quite a tailored service, primarily for students whose first language is not English, but not exclusively. So I have been teaching some students this year from like a native English background, some American students, some from South Africa as well, but probably about 95% of our students, maybe even 98%, will be from a non-English speaking background. And they're almost exclusively at postgraduate level, so MSc level. Some will be at PhD level, some will be undergraduate, but the majority will be postgraduate students. So that kind of target demographic are the ones I work with. And as Li Jing said, we kind of cluster our departments. We teach students from particular clusters. So we have like one teacher, for example, will only teach students from law. Another teacher will teach all of the international students doing all of the different programs related to management. My group's quite large. I work with students from 6 different departments, as Li Jing said, such as international relations, public policy, government, history, and European studies as well, European Institute. And the background of a lot of these students in terms of language is that they will have focused a lot on language proficiency, primarily in order to achieve the proficiency level to ensure their conditional offers become unconditional. Okay, and that primarily comes through IELTS examinations, which is the primary one recognized by LSE admissions. Not the only one, but the principal one. And we have international students coming who are very, very much focused on these tests and on ensuring these tests. But the writing they have to do for these tests, such as IELTS, has very, very little in common with the kind of disciplinary practices, with the kind of essays they're going to have to write when they actually start the programs. There's a very, very, very large difference, substantial difference. And part of, I think, the principal sort of role that I have is bridging this gap. Okay, because it is quite substantial. I think it really is quite substantial for a number of reasons. Primarily the integration of reading and writing, source reading into writing, which is simply not done at IELTS. So we try and really shift that focus from kind of a sort of language proficiency way of thinking to disciplinary practices. So that's like the kind of sort of primary role that we have, basically. So as part of my course that I teach on, it's been quite heavily influenced by 3 different theoretical models of academic writing that came from quite a large body of literature for the last 20 years. Started with Leon Street back in 1998 and has been then taken up by quite a lot of authors, but these are the 3 principal sources that have been inspirational to me in developing my own syllabus. The full reference list is at the end, and I'll be emailing the PowerPoint slides to Li Jing after the presentation. So hopefully she'll be able to share it with you if you wish. So what are these models? Okay, I'm just going to outline these three very briefly and then talk about how they've impacted on course design. So the first of these models is an academic skills model. And Leon Street, initially in 1998, they talked about how this lens, this way of looking at academic writing, focuses very, very much on seeing academic writing as a very technical, quite neutral skill, really, that students almost have to, by rote, kind of memorize, say, like fixed expressions, for example, grammatical structures. So yeah, it's a big focus on like the sort of surface level features of writing: spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Okay, and when we look at academic writing through this lens, through this view, EAP teachers, people in our position, become kind of non-specialists who are kind of sort of just like giving these packages, these packets of knowledge, sort of fixed packets of knowledge to these students. Okay, to these technical skills. And maybe you'll find international students who have submitted essays to the departments. Departments see there's a grammar problem or an issue with their expressions. They will send them to the language center, and it's the responsibility of us as teachers to kind of fix these students almost and then send them back, you know, to their programs, and they're excellent academic writers after a term. And that has some value, that lens, but I think it's become a little bit out of date. Okay, and I think there are two other models that I think say a lot more about what we do and what we try to do with our students. So second model is a socialization model. Okay, and when we look at academic writing from this lens, we see these clusters of departments, which is how we've organized our programs, are like discrete communities. They're like discourse communities, okay? And each community has its own norms, has its own conventions, has its own way of assessing students, has its own, they have their own kinds of essays that they might have to write, maybe different word lengths, different target audiences, different structures. And it's the responsibility of our L2 students to conform to these conventions. Okay, and if you conform to these conventions, then you've entered this discourse community. You're like a welcome part of that community almost. So yeah, it's about academic socialization, and as EAP teachers work with students, then they become more socialized, they become more familiar with these conventions. Okay, so that's our responsibility, is familiarization with these conventions, and be they linguistic resources, paragraph structures perhaps, or referencing conventions also, be three examples. But it's a very, very top-down approach still to language learning. Again, it's us sort of taking this language from on high and still giving these conventions to the students. So and it views language learning being very, very rooted in very fixed systems, and seeing disciplinary writing as, again, almost again, like kind of fixed kind of structures, okay, that don't move. Okay, and while I think that's an interesting way of looking at how we might support and help students, it isn't necessarily quite accurate in terms of how we should view disciplinary writing. So the third model has gained a lot more prevalence, particularly since about 2007, 2008. And this is an academic literacies model. It's informed a lot more by postmodernist, post-structuralist theory. And this model views academic writing now much more as a construction. We're constructing knowledge and we're presenting knowledge to departments. And this approach it's a little bit more bottom up. The focus is a little bit more on the students, and it's the students' responsibility to use language in order to find, as I mentioned in that plenary session just before lunchtime, it's a large part of academic writing from this viewpoint sort of demands of the students to have their own critical voice, to find their voice in the literature. Okay, and it's the responsibility of students to try and engage in the literature a little bit more, to move from description of sources to critical engagement with those sources. Okay, and it's also, as I said in the second point there as well, it's also about maybe recognizing competing perspectives in in, like, say, social science topics that they're talking about, such as international relations. So a lot of the questions departments will be setting will be critically evaluate, critically analyze, discussion kinds of questions. Students are required to engage with the reading and take a position in the reading. Departments will not so much be interested in what the positions of the authors are, but how students can use those authors to support their own positions, you know. So it's putting themselves a little bit more front and center in the essay as well, and using the authors to support their positions. So yeah, I think EAP in this, looking at it through this lens, is a little bit more kind of related to like directly engaging with knowledge in higher education a little bit more, isn't quite so kind of marginalized and kind of passive, not just seeing language as like a kind of a sort of technical kind of sort of fixed thing almost. And yeah, knowledge in this sense is contested, okay, and language is socially constructed. So this is a slightly more nuanced way of looking at academic writing, and I think it's as I said, it's played a big role in academic writing over the last, particularly over the last kind of 10 to 12 years. So those are the three models that I wanted to firstly outline. I want to say a little bit more about academic literacies before I move on, because this is the one that is kind of, I'd say, a little bit more complex than the other two. The three skills themselves, though, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, it's not like students have to start with skills, then move to socialization, then move to academic literacies. In my syllabus planning, I've tried to mix these three models together a little bit, you know. And this takes a very Vygotskian view of teaching and pedagogy as well. Where my background is international relations and linguistics and academic writing, but I'm working with students who are historians, who are specialists in public policy or government, and they will bring their own knowledge. They'll bring their own learning to the classroom. So we are co-creators of knowledge in the classroom. It's not, again, top down, okay? It's much more bottom up. And I think the focus from an academic literacies perspective, it's much more on the process of writing and the processes students go through to plan essays, to draft, to redraft, the iterative recursive process of writing until we get to the product, but not too much focus on model essays. Students love asking for model essays though, but I'm very wary of giving them out to students, because I think I prefer much more to focus on the individual finding the right process for them, I think. So yeah, I think that the models can mix together a little bit, you know, they can really move together. So yeah, I think in terms of academic literacy skills, what we're trying to do is scaffold the students to where they develop their own literacy skills, you know. It's a scaffolding task, you know. And I think that emphasizes the importance of teaching English for specific academic purposes rather than for general academic purposes. I think this approach only really works if we have students from similar disciplines within the same classroom. If the disciplines are too broad, I think that the knowledges become too diffuse, and I think the learning outcomes can break down a little bit. So I think it really emphasizes the importance of discipline specific writing, I think, you know. And yeah, students finding their own voice in writing, okay, and letting them see academic writing as a social practice in and of itself, you know. So those are the three models that I wanted to outline just to start with today. So how has this impacted on my syllabus design? So here are 10 different bullet points for 10 different lessons that I just finished teaching on Friday, yesterday. So I have tried to sort of shift from a socialization sense and blending it together with like an academic literacies view of academic writing, and with like a little bit of sort of skills work, particularly towards the start, where we will focus on quite kind of larger aspects of writing, such as formal academic style, analyzing quite a short essay, finding some of those kind of common, maybe grammatical inaccuracies, and maybe punctuation features, tense choices, lexical collocation, things like that. So I try to keep it quite sort of skills focused in those initial lessons. Then as we shift towards through a socialization sense, we're looking, for example, at the very fixed conventional structures of introductions and conclusions, where I think it's important for students to almost kind of play the game of departments a little bit, kind of play to their expectations of what those paragraphs look like. Then as we go forward in terms of synthesizing sources, citation styles, internal cohesion in the paragraph, and then criticality, we try and look a lot more at argumentation. Okay, the theory of argumentation and how we can help students find a really strong voice. 5 minutes. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Li. Okay, we're going to push through a little bit more quickly just to get through this. That's okay. Okay, there are a few other things I wanted to highlight here from that syllabus. Okay, so when I'm taking an academic literacies approach to academic writing, these are 2 examples of lessons that I focus on, just to help students find their own voice a little bit more. The first thing I wanted to look at very quickly is the very technical skill of referencing. A lot of students have big problems with referencing. They're really not sure how to do it because they haven't done it almost at all in English before. I discuss with students the 2 different approaches to APA referencing, being integral and non-integral referencing styles. Non-integral referencing will use the author's name with the year of publication and perhaps the page number for quotations, but it's all completely separated out of the text. Okay. It's a non-integral style. An integral style will use the author's name as part of the sentence. Okay, then it will have the citation information in parentheses and brackets, or with the page number as well. Okay, and I would tell students to use a variety, use both of these styles if you want. Okay, feel free to mix integral and non-integral referencing styles, but I find integral referencing to be much superior for students. It can really help them find their own voice a little bit more effectively. Okay, and an example of that is, for example, as clauses. Okay, so I would give students this slide and we would look at the semantic meaning between these 2 different sentences. All the second one has is the word as plus the comma, but the meaning substantially changes. Where in the first one, we're using reporting verb to simply describe Nelson's argument. Well, in the second one, we're situating ourselves with Nelson. Okay, so the reader will assume or will infer that the student agrees with Nelson. Okay, so it's such a small semantic difference, but the meaning is substantially different. So using integral referencing style can really help the student or make it much clearer for the student when they're writing. It's like, this is the author's opinion, this is my position. Okay, so it can lead to much kind of clearer differentiation between the author's work and the student's writing. Okay, another approach to integral referencing is nominalisation. Okay, so I would tell students that very often people like to use a lot of reporting verbs in their essay writing. Foucault presents power, Foucault argues that, Foucault suggests that. And to avoid an over repetition of this very descriptive structure, I encourage students, for example, to use noun forms of reporting verbs. Okay, such as Foucault's presentation of power as dynamic and relational. Using the definite article, the presentation of power as dynamic and relational, or a present participle clause with preposition by, for example, by presenting power as dynamic and relational. Foucault raises questions of whether. And if you take this, and when students take this approach, it allows them to use a verb form that is much more critical, rather than using a slightly kind of boring reporting verb, where we have this kind of sort of simple descriptive structure. We can nominalize reporting verbs in order to increase our critical voice a little bit more and situate our own argument with Foucault. Okay, and use Foucault to support what we think, which is primarily the point of our essay writing here. So nominalization can be very useful. So that's one thing I outline. So there's like 3 different rhetorical levels of integral referencing styles. Reporting structure, which is quite descriptive, an as clause, which shows agreement, and nominalization, which is argumentative. Okay, so an integral approach to referencing can allow a much more critical, much more argumentative approach to academic writing rather than a non-integral style. So that's one example of how we can use quite kind of sort of simple approaches to language in order to increase the power, the persuasive power of students writing. So that's one thing I wanted to look at. The second thing I wanted to look at, finally, is the Toulmin model of argument, which I think particularly for exam writing can be of great benefit, I think, to students when they're writing under timed pressure, where they can write main body paragraphs that fit a very influential, a very specific model. Okay, and I think this is particularly important going back to the disciplines. particularly given the year that we're living through, departments are finding many different ways in order to assess students now. In my experience, a lot more shorter essays now, a lot more take-home exams also. So I think it's important that students understand how these different genres can impact on their writing. So this is like a very simple theoretical model here that I just wanted to outline very briefly to finish. Yes, that's fine, Li Jing, no problem. So when we start our main body paragraphs, we start with an argumentative topic sentence. We're making a claim. I encourage students to push beyond a simple descriptive writing or statements of fact in that first sentence in their main body paragraphs, but to say something argumentative, to make a claim. Then secondly, we have evidence. We have evidence from the reading, statistics, evidence from authors, theories, processes, events. How do you support that claim? You know, what's the rationale behind that claim? And when students arrive at LSE, I find that they're excellent at these two. They're okay at making claims. They're great at the reading. They find the evidence, but they then don't make the warrant explicit enough. And Stephen Toulmin, who created this model in the 50s, talked about how the warrant is crucial in persuasive writing because it connects evidence with claims. And there's a lot of departments will give feedback to students saying they're not exploring the literature enough, okay? And because of that, I think that tends to be because students are not making it explicit enough how the evidence they have in their reading supports the claims that they're making in their paragraphs. So if they can focus on this kind of basic three-step process, that can really help them to kind of just again find their own argumentative and evaluative voice in their writing. And it's just another example of how an academic literacies approach and a socialization approach can have a little bit more value in terms of syllabus design and content, rather than a sort of kind of basic kind of skills-based approach, which is a little bit out of date, I think. So that model is something I've looked at in the last few weeks, and students overall have found it very valuable. Okay, I'll stop there. There's the references just at the end there. If anyone wants to do a little bit more reading on these three models, but yeah, they've been very influential in EAP, and I don't see any reason why they won't be influential for CAP also going forward. Okay, thank you very much.
So much, Michael. Thank you. You have provided us with so much things to look for, you know, so many things to think about, you know. While I think people are still digesting with your information, maybe I can just post one question. So how do you define or differentiate academic socialization and academic literacy? I think you mentioned these two, academic socialization and academic literacy. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Academic socialization, particularly, we would do a lot of work with pre-sessional students also. So students who are hoping to come and will come and do intensive summer work with us. And when we're working particularly with these students, it's a big focus on socialization. It's like, here are the particular sort of conventions of your discipline. This is very commonly how introductions are written, how conclusions are written. This tends to be what like main body paragraphs can look like. Here are particular models, and they write to try to kind of learn these very fixed conventions. But it treats disciplinary writing as a very kind of fixed, monolithic kind of structure. And academic literacy sees writing as a little bit more fluid. And I think, as I was saying just at the end of the presentation there, particularly given how sort of teaching has changed so much in the last calendar year, how lesson content, lesson delivery has changed, it's been incumbent on departments to really shift how they assess students. And that shift has demonstrated how disciplinary writing is in actual fact really quite fluid, and it shifts around actually quite a lot, and it's not this kind of fixed monolithic structure. And it puts an academic literacies approach puts a little bit more focus on students finding their own analytical interpretive voice a little bit more, and it sees knowledge in the classroom not as being kind of top down delivered by the teacher, but being as a little bit more sort of co-constructed and giving students a little bit more agency and a little bit more power.
Okay, okay, that's very interesting explanation for me. Actually, I wasn't familiar with this. Just before you go, I have a question, because you mentioned you actually have an IR background. You study IR as a first
Yes.
degree, is that right?
My
So
master's
can
degree
you
was IR, yes.
imagine what is going to be different if you don't have this IR background when you're coming to teach these IR students English? Do you think it's going to be a disadvantage for you?
It's a good question. Credibility, I think, counts as a lot as a teacher. So I think because I can draw on that background, I think it means that students maybe put a little bit more weight behind what I say. I think a little bit. But if I didn't have it, if my master's degree was in something else, I don't think over time it would have made that much of a difference.
The reason I'm asking it is most of us, I think 99% of our Chinese teachers here are interested in this teaching Chinese for IR or for a specific purpose, not necessarily having the background.
Yeah.
So my question is basically, how can we kind of fill the gap, you know, how can we, in the quickest way possible, to know more about IR, you know, to have this the kind of credibility you have got from your IR background?
I think it comes from familiarity with the kinds of assessments they are going to do and the kinds of essays that they're going to write. Like from year to year, academic departments, maybe like the genre of the assessment might change a little bit, but the content never changes that much, really, you know. And the kinds of questions they ask, you know, every second or third year, you know, they come back, they're like boomerangs, you know, same questions keep coming up and up again. So I think, you know, pays a lot of attention in those initial years to the kinds of assessments that they're doing, work a lot with students in office hours, read what they're writing, get very familiar with, and read a lot of feedback as well, read a lot of feedback from departments, and kind of develop a greater sensitivity, I think, to what kind of topics they're writing about. And you can, again, that's an example of co-construction knowledge. You can learn quite a lot from the students and what their output is. But I think over time, I've started to develop a like more one-to-one relationship with departments, and I think that has really helped. But it comes from the students' writing. It all comes from the students' writing, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I'm a big fan of Vygotsky as well, and I like the idea of the co-constructing. You know, we are co-constructing the knowledge with our students.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Michael.
He was terrible at academic writing, but his ideas were great. But his writing was terrible.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. We have to stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Thanks again. It's really great for us to have the opportunity to discuss like this, you know. And take care. Take care.
No problem. Thank you very much, Li Jing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.